thanks for coming,
Sure.
Ben. We have Ben Levine here. I wondered if you could just start off by talking a little bit about what you're doing currently,
Sure.
where you're located, and so forth.
So I'm the director of the Institute for Exercise and Environmental Medicine at Presbyterian Hospital, and that's a joint program between one of the top private hospitals in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and the primary, in fact the only, medical school, the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas. So I'm a full-time state of Texas employee, but I run a research program that it's almost like one of my children. I developed it, started it from the ground up.
When did you start that, Ben?
Well, it began, officially opened in 1992, but the plans for it started even when I was a cardiology fellow in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So.
And were you there then, too, doing your fellowship? And
I was a cardiology fellow in Dallas at UT Southwestern, and then came on faculty there at the beginning of 1990, and so that provided my impetus.
That's a busy time.
Yeah, it's a long story,
Yeah.
and I'm happy to get into it with you if you want.
Okay, so just backing up a little bit, were you an athlete yourself?
So I was an undergraduate at Brown, and I played tennis at Brown, and I was a wrestler. I was the captain and ultimately a coach of the Brown wrestling team. Brought it through its leanest and hardest times. Now it's a major force in East Coast wrestling, but it was not that when I was there.
When were you there?
That was 1978 through 82.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
then you went off to medical school.
Yeah, I went to Harvard Medical School, and at the time it's interesting. In fact, one of the primary impetuses of me getting into medicine at all was the concept of sports medicine. I don't think I really knew what that was at the time. I mean, I can clearly remember sitting in my dormitory in my sophomore year saying, well, what the heck am I going to do with my life? And I can't be a professional wrestler. That was a sport I was really good at.
Right.
I wasn't really good enough to be a professional tennis player. These are things I really liked. I was actually a music major in college, and I decided the world really didn't need another mediocre classical saxophonist. So, I was pretty good at science, and I said, well, maybe I could combine medicine. My dad was a physician and was pretty happy, and sports. Oh, gosh, I'll do sports medicine. I said, all right, I'll start taking some courses and think about going to medical school. And at the time, I hooked up with Lyle McCaley, one of our former presidents, and spent a number of months measuring Q angles. And
so he was in Boston then?
He was in Boston and sort of became one of my mentors as a medical student.
Okay.
And but when I started in medical school, I really didn't have much of a concept of sports medicine until I ran into Lyle. So I spent a bunch of time with him in his lab, and he had me go out and work with Jim Garrick at the Center for Sports Medicine in San Francisco. And I was quite happy with all that, and in fact, I went and did internal medicine at Stanford, but my goal was to do medicine and then orthopedic surgery, and in fact, I did my internship year, I split with one of the orthopedic surgery interns, who was a medical school classmate of mine, and he did a few months of medicine, I did a few months of orthopedic surgery, and ultimately I decided I didn't really like to operate, and there really wasn't much point in spending 4 years as an orthopedic surgery
Is that how long the residency is?
Additional 4 years.
Yeah.
But what I really liked was the physiology. And so I was also, in the background, I was a climber and mountaineer, and Stanford was a wonderful place for that. I mean, one of my first attendings in medicine was Herb Holtgren. Herb was a guy who described high-altitude pulmonary edema in the English literature, was also the director of the VA Cooperative Study in Cardiovascular Disease. So he sort of became a mentor for me about how one translates or incorporates one's avocation into your vocation. And as I got farther along in my career, there's a number of other people that I ran into. I had become, in college, I had become interested in space medicine. My senior thesis was on self-contained environmental systems, and I worked with Carl Schaefer at the U.S. Naval Subbase in Groton, and was very involved, intellectually at least, in the Skylab effort. And so I worked with a guy named Hal Sandler, who was at Ames Research Center out in Northern California. And as I was trying to decide what to do after I finished my residency, I went and talked to Bill Haskell. Bill at the time was the president of ACSM. I'm not even sure I really knew what ACSM was until then. It sounded quite impressive, president of the American College of Sports Medicine, and that must be impressive, right? So I sat in his office and I said, Bill, how do cardiology to me seems the one specialty where exercise is a key component of both the diagnosis and treatment of disease. So I sort of want to do cardiology, but where can I go that I could get good clinical training in cardiovascular medicine and good research training in cardiovascular exercise science? He said, there's really not much question. He'd give his right arm to work with Jerry Mitchell and Gunnar Blomquist in Dallas. I'm this East Coast guy, mountain climber. I'm out in California. I was heading off to Asia for a year and a half after my residency. But Gunnar was really big in the space world, and Jerry was, as of course a famous neural control guy. I say, okay, why not? It's only for a few years. What do you know, right? So I applied, and I ended up being recruited to Southwestern.
Wow!
And
what a move that was.
Yeah, it was a big transition for me. One that I really thought was only going to be short term, but I think one of the major formative movements for me was I got a Henry Luce Foundation scholarship, and I spent a year. I lived in Japan for a year, and it was the first time that I had a prolonged period of time dedicated to research. And I studied high-altitude physiology up in Matsumoto, a small town in the Japanese Alps. And that was really sort of got me interested in the whole research process. We put sheep in a chamber and did human studies on high-altitude medicine. And then I sort of followed that up with a clinical, if you will, period where I ran the clinic for the Himalayan Rescue Association in Nepal.
Oh, gee.
So, by the time I finished with that, we're talking now a year and a half in Asia.
Yeah.
I came back and on,
What was the year or the time period?
This is 1985, 86.
Okay. Okay.
So I was, at 20,000 feet on Everest, and on Christmas Day in 1986, and then on New Year's Day, 1987, I was in the basement of Parkland doing my cath lab rotation. So it was quite a dramatic transition for me.
Yeah.
But it's interesting always how circumstances end up being quite fortuitous. And fortuitous is probably the wrong word with this one, but Drew Gaffney was sort of the guy who drove Gunnar's research effort at that time. Drew is currently a dean at or president, vice president of clinical affairs at Vanderbilt. And they had a big project on the space shuttle called SLS-1, Space Lab Life Sciences 1. And, I became the cardiology fellow who sort of helped move that program along. But if it weren't for the Challenger accident in 1986, they would have finished that project by the time I got there. But it put everything on hold. So they had this ongoing funding that provided a lot of opportunity for us to do research. And one of the primary clinical problems that the astronauts have is they faint. About 2/3 of them can't stand up for more than 10 minutes when they come down to Earth. So, and it also turns out that one of the things that seems to increase the risk of fainting is athletes with high level of fitness. So I said to Gunnar and Drew, Drew was an astronaut candidate. I said, why don't I start figuring out why this is?
Yeah.
Because it sort of merges both my interests, and that sort of started my dedicated research career on the cardiovascular adaptations to training and how that influences blood pressure control and orthostatic tolerance and syncope. And so we've been involved in 5 space missions. And the last one was in the end of 1990s, the Neuralab mission, which I coordinated for the large international research group, and so ran that out of my research institute. So, it's always interesting how those circumstances work out.
Yeah.
And at the time, Jerry Mitchell was doing a lot of going back and forth to Copenhagen. That's how one of his great collaborations was Bengt Saltin. And Bengt and Jerry and Gunnar did the Dallas bed rest study in the 1960s. I said, wow, this would be great. So I wrote a Fulbright grant and got funded to do, I thought, well, I'd merge my own other interests with altitude and exercise, and I'll go do some altitude training work in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And it got funded, and it's quite unusual for cardiology fellows to get their own funding, and most of the time, programs want you to stay and work for some other attending. But I went into Jim Willison's office, who was the chief at the time, chief of cardiology. I said, Jim, time to do my research fellowship, but here's the deal. I want to go to Copenhagen. I want to spend 6 months in Copenhagen, and then I'm going to spend 6 months on Mount McKinley, carry this echo machine up to the top of Mount McKinley. And he said, sounds interesting. You got funding for it? I said, yeah, I got my own funding. He said, okay, see you when you get back.
Oh, wow.
So,
Did you work with Bengt over there then?
I did. So, I really am quite fortunate in that I have worked with some of the real greats in exercise and cardiovascular science, Bengt Saltine and Jerry Mitchell and Gunnar Blomqvist, and have been in contact with some of the real greats.
In the little bit of time we have left, you talked about Haskell being president of ACSM.
Right,
so
right.
when you went down to Dallas, at that time, is that when you joined ACSM?
Yeah, it is. Gunnar got the honor award, the citation award in 1988 or something like that. And that was a meeting that was in Dallas.
Oh, okay.
And so that was really my first exposure to the ACSM meeting. And it was quite impressive for a young, enthusiastic, everything interesting to me kind of guy. I still remember Ethan Nadell gave a talk about the Daedalus project and how they integrated thermoregulation and nutrition and energy and physics into performance, this unique performance outcome. I said, man, that's really interesting. This is a great organization. And so in many ways, I modeled my research institute on at least in part on the Pierce Labs and on the August Kroger Institute. So those were some of the models that I used to build our own program, which is one of the few human integrative physiology programs in the United States, if not the world.
So when you came to ACSM, here's a large group of people that you had heard of, all doing research that was interesting to you. So I can see why that would be exciting.
And it really, for me, it has become one of my cornerstone meetings. So I go to the American Heart in the fall, and I go to ACSM in the late spring, and those sort of drive or lock in, anchor my meeting schedule for the year.
Okay, well, Ben, I know that you have to be somewhere in 5 minutes, so thanks so much for coming and doing this today. We appreciate it very much.
Great.
Thanks.